Erasing Strike is an incredibly hard-hitting Void skill, and it has the capability of automatically being critical strike thanks to the Void Cleave specialization tree. Normally, you'd see these two abilities paired with Volatile Reversal to quickly restore your mana pool, allowing you to sustain the rotation. However, this video will show you that you don't need that tedious skill rotation. You can not only sustain these abilities, but you can add in a mobility skill to quickly zip from pack to pack, obliterating everything in your way. Although we'll primarily be talking about how to play the build and the synergy it provides, don't forget this build has tons of health, capped resist, high armor reduction, layers of mitigation, and an automatic heal, not that you ever need it. First, let's talk about Void Cleave, and this skill is limited to two-handed swords and two-handed axes. If you're unable to use it, make sure you have an appropriate weapon equipped. Void Cleave is going to slide your character forward when you use the ability. In fact, you can actually increase this through the specialization tree as well. You can increase the max distance along with the damage, and you can dramatically increase these effects and convert the skill into a traversal skill. However, this can actually be detrimental against certain enemies or bosses where you're trying to avoid ground effects or just increase your survival. Because of those reasons, we won't be utilizing those specialization nodes in this particular build, but by all means they're absolutely viable in other builds. Instead, we'll be going after nodes that increase our critical strike multiplier by a dramatic amount. We'll also pick up Obliterator, which is going to allow Erasing Strike to automatically crit after Void Cleave hits an enemy. Reducing the cooldown is another way that we are able to sustain this build, not only through mana regeneration, but we're going to actually have the ability to use these cooldowns more often, because both Void Cleave and Erasing Strike have limited charges, so we'll need a means of refreshing these as fast as possible. Erasing Strike has an incredibly large area, and we'll further boost this when we get the opportunity through some of our gear choices as well. It also shred the enemy void resistance, and since we're using a 1-2 combo in terms of Void Cleave, Erasing Strike, we'll be able to apply the maximum of 10 stack. Erasing Strike has a slightly longer cooldown than Void Cleave, and because of this, we'll actually pick up the additional charge through the specialization tree as well, allowing us to always make sure that we can Void Cleave followed by Erasing Strike. On the other end of the tree, we'll pick up Essence of the End, Erasing Strike critical strikes, which will be every time we use Erasing Strike followed by Void Cleave that has hit an enemy, will then grant us an additional buff, 15% void damage, 15% melee damage, and reduced stun duration. With 3 points, this will have a 100% chance to proc, and the buff stacks 3 times. Very useful for the build. As mentioned, this build uses charges for our 2 main damage skills. As opposed to other builds, we're not going to just stand there and continually spam one button. We'll run out of charges, and the character will do nothing until that charge regenerates. Instead, we'll want to safely maneuver our character, hitting with the Void Cleave, repositioning, using the Erasing Strike, reposition again with the Void Cleave, followed by another Erasing Strike, and you'll repeat this pattern until the enemy or enemies go down. When you're mapping, you'll be able to speed up your transition from pack to pack by using Lunge. You can lunge in, Void Cleave, Erasing Strike, lunge to the next pack, Void Cleave, Erasing Strike, lunge to the next pack, Void Cleave, Erasing Strike, and continue on in this manner. This leads to a super efficient gameplay, much better than any build that uses Volatile Reversal. Keep in mind that you could utilize talents such as Resonating Cleave that'll cause Abyssal Echoes to be cast after you use Void Cleave. You could then choose Abyssal Echoes to even be one of your specialization skills. However, that might then require Volatile Reversal in order to sustain the mana cost. The gameplay with Volatile Reversal is somewhat clunky. This build is going to give you a very efficient setup to use from level 1 all the way up till several hundred corruption, and that's a ton of gameplay to be had. This build is incredibly controller friendly, and I like to show that off whenever possible. You see we lunge in, we're going to hit the Void Cleave, then we'll follow up with the Erasing Strike. Since we have charges, we're not going to go after every single enemy, and this build is plenty tanky to let some of the enemies follow or chase you as you go forward, collecting more mobs. Against stronger mobs, you can cast your Anomaly. That'll give you a buff and provide a debuff on the enemy, and just increase your damage output. You'll have plenty of mana pool in order to do this. Overall, the gameplay couldn't be any simpler. Essentially charge in, use a Void Cleave, use an Erasing Strike. If the enemies don't go down, just repeat Void Cleave, Erasing Strike again. This build makes quick work of pretty much all the objectives that you may face in the monolith or echo stage of the game, which is part of the endgame if you're unfamiliar with it. You may notice that at times I'm gaining large chunks of health back. Not only does Lunge have the ability to be used as a movement skill, but we can actually gain 40% of our life every time we use this skill. On top of that, you'll be invulnerable while using the skill. Pairing that with things like Warrior's Renewal in order to recover additional cooldown from the skill, making it available more frequently, and giving it an additional charge allow us to use this pretty much whenever we'd like. As you can see, you just zip around in the map. There's no required gear for this particular build, which makes it fantastic. There are certainly some items that'll increase the power or output of this build, however, you can use this at any point in the game. And that makes one of the new items worth mentioning. Paranoia is a helm that'll allow Lunge to no longer need a target. As you can see, I can spam the Lunge button as often as I want, and I will never move this character. However, with the Paranoia helm equipped, you can now lunge whenever you want, even if there's no enemy there. This is particularly useful for certain bosses that you may encounter in the monolith. You can run Decayed Skull, which will increase your void damage, or even just an Exalted helm that may have comparable properties here. Again, none of these are build defining. And then swap that for Paranoia. The boss that you're facing has a particular mechanic that you need to avoid at all costs. Another item worth showing is Dreamthorn. This is going to give you increased melee damage, increased void penetration. This is equipable at level 15, so if you happen to get lucky and find one of these, you can use this from very early on. Be mindful that you either need a two-handed sword or two-handed axe in order to use Void Cleave. If you don't have a Dreamthorn, you can just use a comparable rare or even an exalted axe or sword that you find. Increased melee void damage, increased void damage, critical strike multiplier, all of these are very strong affixes that you can add to increase the damage output of this build. Chance to shred armor, chance to apply frailty are also very strong affixes that you can have in the suffix portion of items. Increased area for melee skills is really efficient and effective for clearing up mobs while mapping. Getting an amulet with void penetration is incredibly strong for this build, so look for that whenever possible. We'll gain a little bit of mana regeneration through our passive tree, but you'll also want to make sure that you have it on at least one piece of equipment. This will allow you to sustain the mana cost of all the skills or the rotation that we're using. Provided your resistor capped, you'll want to look out for idols like this. And increased melee void damage is just going to further the damage output of this build, and you can stack several of these because you shouldn't have too much of a problem with your resist. Thanks to the passive tree, we're actually able to pick up resist in multiple spots, and you can allocate a different amount of points here in order to increase your resistances as you're leveling or as needed. I'll leave screenshots of all the specializations and passive points at the end of the video, that way you can reference them if the build site happens to be down. Gist is going to be to place 20 points into the sentinel, 15 points into the paladin in order to unlock Sigils of Hope, and the remainder of the points will go into Void Knight because of Void Corruption, which will increase our critical strike multiplier per point in this tree. The Void Knight tree will primarily consist of increasing our health, increasing our damage output, and there's a lot of damage output. Damage output, damage output, damage output, additional survivability, and lastly, mana regeneration. This is a fantastic node, and anytime you have the opportunity to either increase sustain, increase survivability, and increase your damage output all at the same time, thanks to the wonderful passive that we mentioned with Void Corruption, it can really increase the overall power of your character. Paladin tree is pretty straightforward. We're going to put 5 points into Defiance, mainly for the elemental resist that this is going to provide, 10 points into Valor for increased health, and again, you can just see that we have tons of survivability with this build. That'll then unlock the Sigils of Hope. Through the specialization tree, we're going to have the ability to have 4 sigils at one time. Each of these sigils will increase our damage by 25% and have the ability to proc when we kill an enemy. So while we're mapping, we're just going to generate these passively. Furthermore, not only do we get 15% additional void damage per sigil, we're also going to have the ability to restore health when we get dropped below 25% of our health. Anomaly will primarily be used to buff ourselves, but it will debuff the enemy a little bit at the same time. The main things we're after in this tree are the increased duration of the time bubble it will provide, reduced cooldown recovery speed we'll get while this is active, and the increased critical strike chance while we have this active on ourselves, and tremendously helps against high health enemies or bosses. Overall, this is an incredibly strong and fun build to play. With its very smooth gameplay, mobile character, and hard-hitting abilities, you're certain to have a lot of fun with this build. As always, thanks for taking the time to watch, and have a great day.